The Sound of Knowledge Incorporated.
securityfocus.com, and I'm going to be speaking to you guys about network infrastructure, for lack of a better title, honestly. The authentication, management, and routing protocols that run your network. Right off the bat, all you people on the left-hand side, sorry, but we're actually not going to be able to get that screen going. So either you can become friends with the guys here on your right-hand side and squish in, or I guess keep your eyes across here. Unfortunately, the slides in your book aren't going to match up exactly with what I have right now, since they were submitted a couple weeks ago, and I'm always working on these things. But for the most part, you should still be able to follow along. If you're having any problems following where we are, raise your hand, and I'll try my best to get you synced up. Yeah? An updated version will be on the web this afternoon, I believe. Jeff is making those available in real time, so that might be your best bet for keeping track of things once the talk is over. Now, as I said, the title of this talk is sort of the best I could come up with. For lack of a better way to express it verbally, I've elected to sort of have a diagram so I can give you guys a good idea of just what we're talking about. I would tend to think that in this day and age, everyone's pretty aware of perimeter security. Firewalls have been discussed at a huge length in talks, in books, and in posts on the internet. So we're not going to be discussing anything that involves perimeter security. Another thing that I think has been, pretty well covered is network design and infrastructure. People understand that you want to separate out your publicly accessible services from your intranet. People don't always follow these rules, but they understand that they want to in an ideal situation. So we're not going to be touching base on that. Again, I feel that it's covered in books, in just about everything, and there will be talks here that probably will touch on some of those issues. So we're not covering that. And we're not covering host security. People understand that hosts ultimately are the biggest threat they have to their security. If you leave machines unpatched, if you run services that are known to have vulnerabilities, you're going to have problems. It's an understood problem. People understand they need to keep up with patches. They don't, but it's a known problem. So what we're going to be discussing is basically everything left on this here diagram. Not a bunch of black lines and GIFs, but actually switches, hubs, the protocols that run on your network, and some of the devices that live on your network that you don't really think about as security threats. If you'll notice, there's a printer there. We'll cover some of the various strange things you actually can do with devices that you never ever thought could be used for unintended purposes, for lack of a better way to put it. Oops. So basically the topics we're going to be covering are, we'll have a brief overview of what we're discussing, the kinds of threats we're talking about, and sort of the direction we're going to take. We'll cover some basic protocol flaws. These are the things that your network is built upon, as well as some network allocation flaws, things like DHCP and some of the router discovery protocols. Actual routing protocol flaws, the protocols that allow you to easily and transparently do routing also have problems. Authentication flaws, the protocols that you use for authenticating to a router, to a host, or to a dial-up pool, also something that people don't necessarily question the security of. A topic I call network management and other fun flaws. These are the kind of things that amuse me. We'll be covering SNMP, probably the most popular network management protocol. And for those of you who came to the first Black Hat, you might have remembered me very nervously talking about some flaws in network management, specifically SNMP. We won't cover to the same degree of depth, but we'll definitely cover some of the major problems, as well as some generic problems that have been introduced and discovered in routers and switches over the last handful of years, just as an example of some of the problems that people have. And then we'll sort of discuss how these attacks can actually be applied in the real world. A lot of them sound esoteric and sound impossible to implement just when you hear them spoken, but in reality, they actually may be used for a lot of practical attacks. And we will have that interspersed throughout the talk So if we're going to be running short on time and I skip those slides, don't worry, we probably covered most of it already. So, overview. What is network infrastructure? What do I mean when I say network infrastructure? And basically, we're talking about the building blocks of a network, not the hosts that run on the network and not the perimeter defenses, but the actual building blocks of the network, the basic network protocols, things that allow machines to talk to machines, talk to their routers, how you remotely manage machines. One of the big things as a security person, it's really easy for me to say network management, remote network management's a bad idea. It's really easy for me to say SNMP, terrible. It's a reality. People need to use it. We'll discuss some of the problems in it, and we'll try to discuss some of the solutions you can take. Authentication. People think of authentication as a security feature, never really thinking that maybe the authentication they're using is, in fact, a security flaw in of itself. Routing, and just other random things. Again, for lack of a better title, we're calling this network infrastructure, when in fact it's security problems with all the things you guys never think about. So the question is, does this stuff matter? A lot of times people will say, great, you've got some attacks against my network. I don't care. I don't think these are really big threats. And in fact, there are a number of different problems that are presented by these basic things. Basic protocols, I say it's obvious, when in fact, if it's obvious, then I wouldn't be giving a talk about it. The basic protocols, if we're able to attack those and prevent machines from communicating with machines they intend to talk to, and problems like that, we suddenly end up with a situation where we can't trust our own network. It's a definite problem. Network management and allocation. People do that to simplify their networks. They do it so that they can sit at a single machine and control all their network devices and all their hosts. It's a good feature, and it's an ease of use type of thing, but in fact for security, has some issues. Authentication, used for access control, again, hosts, devices, everything. Routing, getting from A to B, very obvious, and other stuff. And these are the things the network runs on, the things that your users depend on, and that you have to have, but you don't have to necessarily run them without being aware of their problems. What kind of impacts are we going to be seeing from these topics? Just to begin, so that you guys have in mind what we're talking about and what we're gunning for lack of a better way to put it. We're going to be attacking protocols that can allow us to hijack connections or spoof sessions or pretend to be other users who we actually aren't. Control network devices. If we can take over a router and alter the flow of your network or take over a switch, maybe we can not even bother having to break into a host. Maybe we can actually watch you doing what you're doing or sniff passwords easily. You know, sort of take the path of least resistance there. Elevate access. I may have some limited access to a machine or some service. If I can elevate my access easily using the existing protocols, all the better. Alter network flow, again, make spoofing, sniffing, all those kinds of things easy. Hide connections, and on and on and on. There's really no end to the kinds of things we can do in security-wise if we try to apply and attack some of these basic protocols. So the first thing we're going to touch is basic protocols. Security at the IP layer has been discussed, again, extensively. People understand the need for things like IPsec and IPv6, and while they're not a necessarily viable solution at the moment, there's work being put into securing these protocols. People understand that TCP/IP, as it was designed, was not designed to be necessarily secure. So they've taken the initiative, the IETF and a number of different groups have taken the initiative to make these protocols more secure. So there's definitely progress and a future to look forward to security-wise for those. However, at the link layer, at the lower layers that your network actually run upon, security was never a factor and really isn't a factor still to this day. Ethernet, which is what most people run on their networks, and even ATM and others, were not designed with security in mind. They were designed to be relatively lightweight and efficient at what they do. They've existed for a long time, and their designs are based off of a time when you could trust, or at least hopefully could trust, your employees and the things on your network to not really necessarily be targets, or to even be exposed to places where they could be targets, but in fact they can. So the basic protocol that's most obvious to talk about is ARP, the Address Resolution Protocol. For those of you who aren't familiar with ARP, it's used to map a network IP address to a physical Ethernet address, typically used on your local network to identify machines within your subnet or to identify your routers. And what will happen is it's when I initially want to talk to a machine at the IP level, I will ask, what's the MAC address for this IP address that's on my network, and it'll get back a response saying, my MAC address is this. or some kind of proxy or something to that effect. And it's a simple protocol, very lightweight, very easy to see in action. If you fire up a sniffer, you'll see many, many ARP requests and replies. Very simple. Not designed with security in mind. So what kind of problems does ARP present? Well, right off the bat, there's a lack of authentication. It's really difficult, just because of the way Ethernet's designed and the way an ARP is used, to authenticate effectively. When all you have is an IP address, how do you really know a machine is who it claims to be? So ARP replies are typically ARP replies are typically cached and accepted in cache without concern for the origin of where they were received. Basically, this means if I advertise for an address or a MAC address for a machine using ARP, I really have no way of knowing if the address being returned is really necessarily the address I'm asking for. There's no way for me to tell if, in fact, the response is coming from the host I intended to come from. There's no, as I said, there's no method to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate messages. The question of how can this be done, it's a hard problem to solve. It's not something I can offer a good solution for right now. So what kind of things can we do with a lack of authentication? Invalid ARP replies. When I see a who is broadcast on the wire, anyone can respond to it. Typically when people use switches and things like that, until the switch knows the addresses associated with the different ports on the switch, they're in a kind of a broadcast mode where ARP requests are passed along. So even if I'm on a switch network, there's potential when I see a solicitation for a who is request for me to respond with anyone I want to respond with. I can tell them that, you know, it's my MAC address. It's a broadcast MAC address. It's a variety of different things, and there's really no kind of there's very rudimentary filtering that goes on most operating systems for this, but in fact, there's little way to know if I'm getting who I want to get. And gratuitous ARP replies. Often machines will cache, switches and machines will cache any ARP reply they see as being on a specific port or being from a specific machine, and it's possible to just put so many in there for machines that haven't even been booted or currently down that I can actually poison an ARP cache to the point where you can't really tell who you're talking to anymore. So what kind of things can we do with this? Well, if we can replace entries in an ARP cache, we can perform easy denial of service attacks. Obviously, if a host believes that the corresponding MAC address for a specific host is something other than it is, those packets will not be received by that host and a denial of service will take place. Pretty basic. If I can reply to requests with a compromised host as a router or name server, I might be able to easily do things like cache poisoning without actually having to poison a name server. I can set up a name server that replies with information that I want it to reply with. It can be used for traffic hijacking. If I can poison an ARP cache, I may be able to hijack a session without the ensuing ARP storm that always occurs. Or I can affect host-based trusts. If I can make a machine believe I'm another IP address easily, then I can be that machine and I can exploit any kind of trust relationship. One of the things we can do is we can overpopulate ARP caches. Typically, in a lot of implementation of switches and some hosts, if the table becomes too large, it will actually be flushed. Ideally, this isn't what should happen. What should happen is the oldest entry or the least recently used entry is the one that should in fact be flushed and replaced. But some hardware and some software will actually blow away their entire ARP cache. And this can allow, for instance, if I'm behind a switch port, I may have an opportunity to kick it into a broadcast mode where I'm able to see traffic or I'm able to reply as being a host, which I really wasn't, which was already cached. So there's basic ARP attacks. The next thing we're going to cover is some of the network configuration protocols. Like I said, we're going to cover DHCP and some of the router discovery stuff. DHCP these days is becoming more and more of a staple of networks. As they're getting larger and larger and more people are working with laptops or working with machines they frequently move around, administrators are using DHCP as one of the best solutions they've been able to figure out to the problem of how do I prevent machines from colliding IP addresses, how do I prevent, if I move a machine, how do I know it's still going to work? So DHCP is very popular for ease of use and installation, particularly amongst PC users. Hasn't quite caught on as much in the Unix world. And basically DHCP uses a UDP transport. sends its request to the broadcast address from 0.0.0.0. Not necessarily important who it's sending it from, but the fact that it's UDP will pose a problem. So what's wrong with DHCP? Well, it's unauthenticated, so anyone can request an address. It's undirected, meaning anyone can respond to a request, and has limited ACL capabilities. We can limit the number of addresses assigned to a specific MAC, and in some cases we can assign an address to a specific MAC based on leases and things, but in some ways that defeats some of the ease of use things that DHCP has been designed for. So what can we do with DHCP? Right off the bat, we can get all the addresses. If we keep on requesting for addresses, forging our MAC address, we can snatch every DHCP-able address. This will prevent people from getting on their network and actually doing their work. Or we can grab all the addresses and actually reply to hosts as they request them with the addresses we've taken and alter some of the data that's presented within this DHCP packets. We can alter, maybe use a router that we have access to or use a nameserver we've compromised as part of the information we're passing back and actually use that information to further compromise that host at some later point. We can also deregister hosts. If we can impersonate the server, we can tell hosts that your license or your lease has been revoked and you're no longer registered on the network. Also a nuisance, mostly just a denial of service, but could cause a host to re-request an address, in which case there may be potential for an attack. And there's also potential for us hijacking machines based off of that. And recently, there have been some implementation flaws in the ISC's implementation. I'm sorry about that. Of DHCP, which has caused the potential for a actual machine compromise to exist, whereby if I can reply with well-contrived information, it can actually overflow a buffer on a machine that's requesting a DHCP address and actually gain access to that machine when in fact I have no right to be there. Definite problem. Well, what can we do about DHCP? As DHCP isn't necessarily a very low-layer protocol, we can add authentication. The ISC has proposed and is doing some additions to their 3.1 implementation to allow authentication, and others have implemented proprietary mechanisms for doing DHCP authentication. The problem with this is it sort of defeats the ease of use of DHCP. When the idea is that I can take any machine and plug it into a network and get an address, having to go through these additional authentication mechanisms requires knowledge on both sides in order to be done effectively, and it creates a problem where DHCP isn't quite as appealing as it once was. We can also mitigate some of the problems by, oh, that gets chopped off, not allowing dynamic assignment of things like DNS servers and routers. If we can lock those things down, we somewhat reduce the risk of the information that DHCP is actually passing to the host, and maybe can prevent some of the attacks we've talked about. One of the other topics that people often don't see as being a problem or don't even understand is running are route discovery protocols, things like IRDP, the Internet Router Discovery Protocol. Recently, within the last year or so, the guys at Loft actually released an advisory on this where they noted that Windows 95, 98, Windows 2000, and Solaris under certain conditions will actually accept any IRDP advertisement for a route. And the really strange thing about this was that it would actually prefer these routes over a default route on the Windows platforms. And the problem here, obviously, is that IRDP is a very simple, unauthenticated protocol again, very easy to forge, very easy for anyone to impersonate a router and basically alter the flow of traffic so that perhaps they have certain traffic directed directly through them for specific hosts and allows them to sniff machines they might otherwise be able to sniff, or hijack sessions, or sniff, or all sorts of a variety of different attacks. Things that we can do to fix this, basic things are assign router addresses via DHCP if you're going to do it. Statically assign them if you can, statically assign name servers. Windows, you can't do this. On Unix platforms, you can. Or just generally distrust these things. It's not necessarily a flaw with the implementation. It's not Microsoft specific or Solaris specific, but actually a generic protocol deficiency. Again, not a whole lot you can do about it other than disable the acceptance of these things or filter against them if you can. Next, we're going to talk about some of the gateway protocols. Originally, I had a section on some of the external gateway protocols, things like BGP, but I decided it wasn't necessarily topical to the discussion at hand. And for those of you who were here last year, there was a talk given by Batsy, which I'm sure is still available on the Black Hat site, which was phenomenal about BGP. So if you're interested in some of the flaws there, definitely go to that talk. He spoke about things that I couldn't even understand, and it was just a phenomenal talk. So if that's where your interests lie, definitely go check that out. So for the interior gateway protocols, we're going to be talking about some of the flaws in RIP version 1, version 2, and OSPF. Now, RIP is basically the most basic routing protocol used today. There have been some predecessors to it which also had problems. For the most part, you don't see those on networks anymore. RIP is a very simple protocol. It's a distance vector IGP, meaning it's hop count based. It exists in two forms: version 1, version 1 and version 2, which has backwards compatibility. Version 1, and version 1 in particular is very insecure. Most machines, especially Unix machines out of the box that run things like Route D, will listen to RIP requests. A number of routers by default will do that. Depends on how your machine's configured, obviously, but there's definitely a threat here, which people don't really acknowledge. So what are the flaws in RIP? Well, we're going to come back to both of these flaws time and time again with almost everything we talk about. Transport method and authentication. RIP's transport method is UDP, and for those of you who've probably been following security for some time or have done any kind of programming security-wise, UDP is a very, very easy protocol for an attacker to spoof. TCP requires, in order to spoof, the knowledge of sequence numbers, port assignments, being able to predict sequence. It's a very difficult thing to spoof TCP. It's doable if you can predict the sequence numbers, but it's not as straightforward as UDP. UDP is unauthenticated and connectionless, meaning if I can write a packet to the network, I can send a UDP packet purporting to be from just about anyone, and there's no way to differentiate between it and a legitimate host. So it's unreliable. There's no sequencing of packets. Easy to send arbitrary data. Again, I can send things out of order very easily on UDP. There's really no guarantees on what you're doing. And again, that allows us to send RIP packets purporting to be from a router or purporting to be from anywhere if we're ACLing based on where the source is. And it also allows me to potentially hide my tracks if I don't want to get caught. What are the RIP authentication flaws? Well, RIP version 1 has no authentication whatsoever. So obviously there's a problem there in that anyone can send a RIP message and a machine will accept it. Version 2 recommended in the original RFC a cleartext authentication. It's not ideal. It's a step in the right direction. Some authentication is better than none. But obviously cleartext authentication is susceptible to any kind of sniffing attack. If I can see these packets, I can obtain the password and I can send RIP version 2 packets purporting to be from a legitimate host. In another RFC, they described MD5 key ID based authentication, which is definitely a step in the right direction. Whether or not there's problems there, questionable. So what kind of things can we do? Well, if we can forge RIP messages, again, we can spoof routes and alter routes on machines, which can lead to traffic hijacking, traffic monitoring, and redirecting traffic from trusted to untrusted networks or trusted to untrusted machines. If we can obtain the RIP version 2 password, as I just said, you can impersonate and alter routes using RIP version 2 if those are the only things accepted. So what can we do about that? Well, if we can disable RIP version 1, it's a good step. If we use RIP version 2 with MD5, it's an even better step. The more and more complex these authentication methods become, there may be flaws in them. There may be replay issues. There may be other more esoteric problems, but the harder we can make it for someone to impersonate or spoof a protocol, the better off we are, even if it's just rudimentary steps like adding a password. So yes, definitely enable MD5 authentication if you can. Disable RIP completely is the best option, and use OSPF if you need to use an interior gateway protocol for routing. Most people actually don't. Most people use static routes and have things like Route D running because they're started by default. Definitely disable everything you can. Okay, OSPF is basically recommended as a replacement for BGP. It's also a interior routing protocol. And it was intended and designed as a replacement to RIP. Unfortunately, a lot of places are not running it, where in fact they can. I think this is due in a large part to a lot of Unix machines ship with Route D, but not Gate D. Route D doesn't support OSPF, at least not in a lot of the shipping versions. I'm not sure if it's supported in non-commercial shipping versions, but Gate D is actually a better option if you're going to use OSPF. The only OSPF security flaws really are based on authentication. You can use OSPF without authentication. By default, it may be off in some implementations, and obviously this makes it somewhat easier to spoof and to impersonate. A cleartext simple password authentication is possible. It's usually the default setting if passwords are enabled at all, which means if I can sniff the network, obviously I can send OSPF messages impersonating whoever I want to be. And there are MD5 options, which obviously are a lot better. And the authentication type is determined by a code field. It's not very important as a vulnerability in of itself, but it is an easy way to determine what you're using. So if we can forge messages, again, alter traffic flow, makes sniffing, spoofing, etc. very easy. Enable MD5, again. Okay, the next thing we're going to hit upon is authentication flaws. We're not necessarily touching upon things like how does a Microsoft machine authenticate to a primary domain server. That's not the kind of thing we're necessarily talking about. We're talking more about in the infrastructure-wide type view of things, and it's also partially due to the fact that I'm not all that Microsoft savvy. We're going to be talking about the kinds of flaws that we can inflict upon a network if we can attack things like Radius or TACACS or the other protocols we use to authenticate to network devices or dial-up, and in some cases to hosts. So for those of you who are unclear, and I doubt there's any of you, authentication is a means for verification and granting of access. It's basically the way we determine if user A has rights to be on a machine and what kind of rights they have on that machine once they're there. And the problems we see here range from denial of service to active and passive attacks against the authentication, which can lead in the end to a total compromise, be it of a host or a router. And it may allow us, if nothing else, to elevate access once we're on a machine. So what are the different authentication mechanisms we're going to discuss? We're going to discuss a few of the ones that are pretty popular on networks these days. Radius, TACACS and its variants, including XTACACS and TACACS+. NIS and NIS+ we'll touch on briefly. Again, typically used as a host-based authentication protocol, if you can even call it that. It's more of a distribution mechanism. We'll touch on it briefly, and we'll touch slightly on LDAP, which is being used in a lot of environments as a replacement for things like NIS and Radius and TACACS. So the first thing we'll touch upon is Radius. Radius is the remote authentication dial-in user service. It was originally designed to allow people connecting into dial-up modem pools or connecting to a terminal server to authenticate and establish their connections. Hence its name. It's used for authenticating to just about anything these days. Some people use it to authenticate to their routers, switches, and their network hardware. Some people use it to authenticate to their hosts. It's used all over the place now. The RFCs, if you're interested in reading more or just want to be familiar with them, are 2138 and 2139. They're big and thick and chock full of a lot of confusing information. They may be helpful to you if you need further information. It's used to authenticate users, obviously. And the intention is to move authentication and the storage of authentication information off device and off machine. The idea being, if in fact you compromise a machine, at least this way, more extensive password information about other users isn't available. You have a central authentication server called a NAS, Network Authentication Server. And some of the popular implementations are from Livingston and Merit, which is a educational group. So what's the Radius security model? There's some argument to be made that Radius security is kind of an oxymoron, but Radius uses a UDP transport, and they go to great lengths actually to justify their use of a UDP transport. It's lightweight, it's easy to use, it eliminates some of the problems with needing to worry about sequencing and things like that. It makes implementation of the protocol a lot simpler. Unfortunately, it represents somewhat of a security problem. Within each Radius packet, without getting too in-depth, The two types we really are going to be interested in are the access request, which is how you request access to a device, and an access reject and an access accept. The access request basically will take a user password, send it to the Radius server, and verify that it is in fact the user it claims to be. And the way it does this is it has a shared secret that each host shares with the authentication server, and it takes something that they call an authenticator, which in fact is just a randomly generated 16-octet integer, roughly randomly generated, which they combine with a secret, MD5 it, and then XOR it against the user password. And this is how they prevent people from easily obtaining user passwords. It's a decent method. It's not wonderful, but it works. Access rejects and access accepts, the way we verify those is, again, we use the shared secret, and the reply will come back using some of the fields within the Radius packet and the shared secret, and have an MD5 across that whole concatenated value. And that's how the client requesting verification to the server knows that it is in fact from the machine that we hopefully assume is a server. So what are our flaws? Obviously, the shared secret holds the key to Radius's security. If we can gain the shared secret, we're able to do just about anything we want on a Radius network. So one of the active attacks we can kind of take is if we spoof or just send an access request with all known values. It sort of eases an attack in that if we know what our authenticator is, if we set our authenticator, our username, our password, our lengths, and all that kind of things, we can basically get back a rejection method, a rejection packet that we have all the known values in. And we're able to take that value and dictionary attack against it. And the idea being here, typically shared secrets are generated by people and have a lot of the same flaws that any password does. People often will use passwords that are easily guessed or dictionary based, easy to remember, too short. And the problem that presents itself is the same problem that presents itself with user passwords, in that when it has to be used frequently and distributed to lots of machines, people want something they can easily remember and not have to write down, and often that leads to insufficient passwords. There's also a passive attack that's relatively similar to the active attack. If I can sniff the network and I can see Radius requests going out, I can grab a request access and begin to use that packet as the basis of an attack. We can actually do the prior attack using that, as all the values except for the shared secret are exposed in plain text in a Radius packet. So it's pretty simple. We don't have all known values, and some of the values are larger. It may take us a little more time to do our MD5 calculations, but for the most part, we're able to attack that. And also, if we know a user password, we can use that to obtain the MD5 of an authenticator, which we know, plus the shared secret, and we can a dictionary attack against that. Just presents another opportunity to try to recover the shared secret. There's also, as we said, passive attack too is basically the prior active attack, just using sniffing rather than actually sending a packet. It works very similarly and has a similar success rate. Is there like a high-pitched, is anyone, is the sound guy here? Yeah, that might be it. Okay, one of the other Radius flaws we have is replay. Again, Radius servers use an authenticator to match packets, to match requests with accepts. And if an authenticator gets reused and is cryptographically random, it severely affects the integrity of that packet. We can use things in replay. If we see an authenticator go by, we may be able to take a packet we saved previously and re-inject it on the network and potentially gain access to a machine or deny access for some other reason. If we can predict the authenticator, there's also an opportunity for trying to race, say, the Radius server with a reply and gaining access where we probably shouldn't have, or for some other reason can't legitimately. As with most of these protocols that we're going to be discussing, there's really not a whole lot you can do in terms of fixing Radius to some of these basic problems. Most of Radius configuration allows you to configure on a per host basis. As it's UDP, it's in some cases difficult to directly send a UDP packet and be able to get the response back if I'm in fact spoofing a source address. If I'm able to use some of the other attacks we've talked about, though, alter routing flow, or maybe make a switch go into learning mode, I may be able to see the response and can use that kind of information. If you're using Radius, if you do it on a per host basis, setting the shared secret, use unique ones if possible, it goes a long way in fixing those problems. And it's really the best avenue of defense. Radius is, in a lot of people's eyes, a very, not a foolishly written protocol, but a protocol that's sort of seen its day. And there's some new variants. There's one called Diameter, which is a set of extensions to Radius that fixes some of the field length issues that don't directly affect security, but affect the usability of Radius, and also, again, fixes some of the security problems. So if at all possible, don't use Radius, and if you do, use it using unique passwords, good passwords, the same things you hear over and over again with user passwords. Next we're going to hit on is TACACS, XTACACS, and TACACS Plus. The question marks after the acronym Terminal Access Control System is really because no one's really sure what TACACS stands for exactly. The RFC describing TACACS was written significantly after the protocol was widely deployed for a number of years, and that was their best guess at what it stood for. Seems reasonable enough. Who knows? It's an old protocol that was developed by BBN from Milnet to be used to authenticate, again, users logging into routers, hosts, and a variety of network devices. And it's similar in concept to Radius. Basically, the idea behind both these protocols is there's a central authentication server, which does the bulk of the authentication, and the actual clients, which is the host you're trying to log into or device you're trying to log in, has limited knowledge of how to authenticate the user. They only know the information they need to obtain, and they send it to the server in order to actually determine the validity. And if you're interested in looking at the RFC, it's 1492 for TACACS Plus, which is an internet draft for the TACACS Plus protocol. TACACS and XTACACS both use a UDP transport, and as we've mentioned before, UDP transports are very, very difficult to secure properly, as are spoofable. Sending responses pretending to be a server or sending requests pretending to be a client, trivial to do. There's really no way to prevent someone from attempting to do these things. The normal method of authentication is cleartext, though some newer implementations can use MD5. If usernames and passwords are sent unencrypted, obviously it's a real good opportunity to sniff on some basis to determine usernames and passwords. Very simple. And it's also a good easy way to crack passwords online, as there's no authentication to the TACACS server. If you want to guess passwords and just grind against things, you can just hit the TACACS server, repeatedly guessing, for a given username, the password, and it's a little noisy on the network, and someone's probably going to notice, but then again, they might not. It gives a good opportunity for guessing passwords when you don't necessarily have access to a password file. TACACS Plus was designed as a secure replacement and a little more efficient replacement for TACACS itself and XTACACS. So it doesn't suffer from the easy spoofing due to the use of UDP. It actually uses a TCP transport, so it is sequenced, though it may be hijackable. And recently, for those of you who follow BugTrack, there was a very well-written description of the flaws in TACACS Plus written by a guy who goes by the name Solar Designer. For those of you who've read it, this will all be old news for you. And for those of you who haven't, who are using TACACS, aside from whatever I'm going to tell you, it's a very well-written description of some of the problems, and goes into some of the details that I won't go into. Very well written, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is actually coming from him, so not as to confuse anyone with me grabbing credit for them. For authentication and encryption, it may be possible to conduct attacks similar to Radius, and we'll discuss those in a second. And some of the default failure modes may pose problems. One of the Cisco networking books, one of the security books specifically, described how to set up TACACS Plus, and their example, which I thought was pretty disturbing, actually had their last line as the TACACS server last resort succeed, meaning if a router couldn't contact the TACACS Plus server for whatever reason, the router would fail open. Not a good idea. I think that's pretty obvious to most people when they see it. I'm not really sure why they recommended doing that. It's pretty foolish, especially if I can in some way cause a denial of service against attack X plus server, and chances are it's running on some Unix or some NT machine, and there's a good chance that it won't be hard to do that. So, attack X plus authentication. There's no integrity checking, and one of the things that this paper I was referring to talked quite a bit about was the fact that their encryption mechanism is based off of using MD5 and these sequence numbers and sequence IDs that are associated with attack X plus packets. If I can flip bits in a packet as it passes through me, I don't necessarily have to know the secret that they're using in the MD5, and I don't necessarily have to be able to send my own packets. I can just flip bits in packets and dramatically alter how they're decrypted. There's no integrity checking. When it decrypts the packet as it's using some kind of MD5 hashing mechanism, there's no way for it to tell if the packet's been tampered with during transport. So it presents a serious problem, especially for accounting type applications where, say, the elapsed time was a good example given. The elapsed time of a login can be changed from 9,000 seconds to 1,000 seconds by flipping a single bit. The encryption for attack X plus is heavily dependent on session IDs. The idea being, if we can force a session ID collision, or we just wait long enough, we'll eventually see a session ID wrap, and we can use that information in conjunction with known plaintext to decrypt any packet that also has that session ID or sequence number, and actually be able to extract passwords and other plaintext out of packets we shouldn't have otherwise had access to. Well, the final problem is there's a lack of padding in critical places. It's kind of nebulous, and I don't think I word that very well on my slide. Basically what that means is if a user has a 7-character password, when it's transported in attack X plus packet, it's very obvious that it's 7 characters that are being transported. If it's 6 characters, 6. If it's 8, 8. So it makes an opportunity for someone sniffing over the wire to say, this user has a 6-character password. I know that. And dictionary attacking something that small is pretty trivial. People can do that very efficiently these days, as well as 7-character passwords. 8, a little more difficult. But again, if I have a good idea of how long a password I'm dealing with is, it presents a real opportunity for simplifying any kind of attack. Now, in terms of actual fixes to this, a lot of these problems are specific to implementation. The dependence upon session IDs that must be unique. Obviously, you're going to have a wrapping issue at some point. If the session IDs aren't purely random, however, that's an implementation problem, and that can be fixed. A lot of the problems noted were in Cisco's free implementation of the attack X plus server, which they don't support. And when these vulnerabilities came out, they sort of came out and said, well, you know what, we don't support this version, and we can't fix it for you, but there are patches available. And some of the things you can do is, again, use good shared secrets. Those go a long way in protecting you. And in the event of a network compromise, if you're using a switch network and they don't have access to where attack X packets typically are flowing, there's definitely some protection there. NIS and NIS Plus, again, another authentication protocol, though a little different than Radius and TACAX in that they're not centrally managed. It's more of a password and shadow and various other things distribution scheme. It's a network information service originally designed by Sun, called YP for those of you who remember back that far. It's very popular scheme for distributing password, name service information, and a variety of different kinds of maps, and it uses an RPC-based transport. For those of you who follow at all bug track over the years, you've probably seen more NIS and NIS Plus flaws than you can count, and those aren't necessarily protocol flaws so much as they're implementation flaws. And while that's a definite hazard, it's not necessarily the biggest problem or the only problem to worry about when it comes to using NIS. Regular NIS transports in plain text. This means that all the information requested, including shadow passwords, if you have a separate shadow password file over NIS, are transported in plain text, meaning anyone who can sniff your network has access to this information. If I'm a user on a typically set up NIS machine, I have access to the YPCat command, and I can pull password files along with their passwords encrypted within the file. NIS is only protected by a domain name. This is a map name that they give to the the NIS domain, and this is usually easily guessed. People will usually take their domain name, and rather than tagging it with .com, they'll tag it with .yp or something to that effect. There's programs out there that will grind against this and attempt to guess it. Not difficult to find. And there's many vulnerabilities and limitations. As I said, NIS and NIS Plus have had dozens of problems over the years related to RPC, related to buffer overflows, related to you name it. NIS has had problems with it. And because of that, it's gained a reputation of being highly insecure. There's dozens of acronyms for NIS that are less than flattering security-wise. NIS Plus is a decent protocol. It's not bad, but the problem is a lot of people consider it too complex and too unwieldy to bother installing. And as they've been looking forward, they see other protocols being marketed and being hyped as a replacement for NIS, and they've sort of skipped over NIS Plus in favor of other options. Solution-wise, run NIS Plus if you can, and if you want to avoid NIS altogether, investigate alternatives like LDAP, which is one of the things that Sun in particular has been pushing as an alternative to NIS, even though it can actually run in conjunction and on top of NIS as an option to authentication. So we're going to touch on LDAP very briefly. For those of you who were here last year again, Pete Shipley and Tom Jankowitz spoke at length about LDAP vulnerabilities and LDAP flaws, and they covered things to a depth that I could never attempt to match in this short period of time. LDAP also has a set of problems, and we'll discuss them briefly. For the most part, I'm going to tell you things, and you'll read them, and you'll think they're bad, but LDAP, in fact, isn't as bad as people make it out to be. The major problems with LDAP actually stem from the fact that it is new and relatively untested. People aren't familiar with how it works. People don't know how to set it up yet, and there aren't really a lot of good resources out there that talk about some of the common configuration and implementation issues associated with LDAP. Out of the box, a lot of the ACLs for these types of services are pretty poor. Sun is now shipping a LDAP PAM module that's intended to be a possible replacement for NIS in certain environments. A number of different vendors are shipping both free and commercial implementations of LDAP authentication implementations for Windows platforms and for Unix platforms. But for the most part, they're still a little underdeveloped in terms of configuration. From the last time I talked to Pete and Tom, they both had indicated that the authentication mechanisms hyped for LDAP are not fully implemented. Most people are using shared secrets or static passwords, which is reasonably secure, but not wonderful. Obviously, if you compromise a host, you'll obtain that information. Certificate-based authentication is only partway there. There's a lot of arguments being made that it's not as good as it should be, or it's not as fully implemented as it needs to be in order to be truly deployed and useful. And there's a large possibility for denial of service attacks. If I flood with requests, I can get the LDAP server constantly checking for validity of packets, and I may be able to overload that server to the point where it no longer responds to legitimate requests. Again, these flaws are not necessarily something that I think should prevent anyone from using LDAP as a possible solution if they want to. It does have a future that suggests security's been kept in mind and is being used. It's just not quite there yet in some situations and for some people. Finally, we're reaching my favorite topic, and the part of the talk I actually like the most. Network management and other fun flaws. They're probably not fun for you guys, they're just fun for me. We're going to touch upon SNMP, and again, SNMP is something that I've done way too much research in and found a lot of flaws that are maybe a little too esoteric to be practical. So we won't really touch upon those. We'll touch upon the actual flaws that do affect you. We'll go over some of the interesting and kind of disturbing vulnerabilities that have come across on routers and switches in the last year or two. People have started to actually target these things as sources of security problems, and as more and more people are doing work with these things are discovering protocols and other variety of things that are actually flawed. And we'll discuss printers, because printers amuse me to no end, and it's kind of fun to talk about them. The goal in this whole section, just to preface things, is to make you aware of the fact that there are security issues with anything that's on your network. Again, I mentioned that at the beginning of the talk. Printers, when I say printers, people usually laugh at me and think I'm smoking something or something's wrong with me or that I'm just not serious, when in fact it's just a good example of how something as benign as a printer can actually present a security threat. So keep in mind, when I'm saying printer, I could just as easily be talking about anything you plugged into your network that you kind of never thought much of. So right off the bat, SNMP is a simple network management protocol, and it is far and away the most popular network management protocol out there. It's been around, everything implements it, and everyone uses it. How are we doing time-wise? No, I've got like half an hour.
We're going to patch the audio of this room into that firewall. So if people want to follow along, they can get a seat in that firewall.
Oh, are they done in that room or something?
Well, no, there's like...
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
we can open up the barriers.
No, that room has more technical, but behind that...
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you want to...
Okay. So if people here are sitting on the floor and would rather not see the slides and just listen?
Well, they have it in the book, too.
Oh, well, yeah, Jeff just informed me that they're opening one of the rooms back up and they're going to patch the audio into that room. So if you feel more comfortable listening and catching the slides again on the website when they're updated this afternoon, you can do that. I won't be offended. Okay, back to SNMP, the Simple Network Management Protocol, most popular protocol. Everything implements it, down to power strips and UPSs and individual on-machine cards and you name it. SNMP is everywhere. And some security expert said it's one of the single biggest security nightmares on networks today. And I agree. It's a pretty big security problem that people just don't know or don't care about. I'm not 100% sure which it really is. So SNMP's flaws fall into three basic classes: the transport mechanism, the authentication mechanism used, and the amount of information disclosed by SNMP. The kinds of things, obviously, the transport mechanism is going to be very similar to the other protocols. It's UDP based, meaning it's unreliable. We don't know if packets get where they are destined to go. SNMP actually has a couple of different types of packets it will actually send. And one of the things a lot of people use are traps. And traps are used by a SNMP enabled host to send information to the SNMP manager. It's sort of an opposite direction. Rather than pulling information, it's pushing information to the manager. And as it's UDP, it is unreliable. Those packets may or may not be received. A lot of, as a side note, a lot of IDS systems use traps now to do information pushing to their management workstations. The fact that it's UDP and unreliable makes me question how much you should rely on that kind of information, especially because it's UDP and I can forge them. If I can bombard a station with bogus attacks, I may be able to slip a real one through. So unreliable and easy to forge, like all UDP packets are. SNMP authentication is based on roughly two factors. Host-based, meaning I can ACL a machine that accepts SNMP requests based on a host or an IP address. If I do it on an IP address, it fails because it's UDP. Obviously, I can spoof that information, not a problem. And if you're actually using a host name, which is a terrible idea anytime you're doing any kind of ACLing, if I can alter your name server or pretend to be someone I'm not, and the actual SNMP managed host isn't matching forward and reverse records, there's all sorts of different attacks I can take to make a host believe I'm someone who I'm not. The major authentication mechanism, however, is what they call a community. And a community basically is a shared password. It's transported in plain text in every SNMP packet. And obviously this can be attacked by as it's UDP, typically hosts don't report failures. It's really easy to predict or guess, or even brute force an SNMP community name. It's really easy to modify an SNMP client to repeatedly try to set values on an SNMP-enabled host or device and use that to guess a community name or password. And unfortunately, more often than not, there are a lot of default communities on almost every SNMP-enabled device. This is just a very small list of some of the defaults that I've seen and people have seen time and time again. Almost everybody. I can't think of a single example of an SNMP-enabled device that doesn't ship with public as a default read-only community that's accessible by anybody. And a lot of people don't really think much of this, thinking it's just an SNMP. They can't write anything. They don't really think that that could be a problem. And they see communities like private and write, and all private was something that Solaris had. Monitor was something that I believe 3Com had. On and on and on. Everybody is guilty of having these default and often undocumented communities in their implementations. And this allows any attacker who keeps track of these things or reads bug track or even just has an opportunity to play with these things to compile a pretty good list of things they know are going to work against these machines. The final thing that SNMP really gives away is just too much information. There's so much information available as a result of an SNMP request that it gives away a lot of potentially useful information to anyone looking to manipulate your network. Things like routing tables, network topologies, network traffic patterns are things that are standard in most SNMP implementations. Every vendor often goes and extends that and has a enterprise MIB, is what they call it, management information base. And that will actually contain information that's specific to that vendor. In some situations, I've played with older, for example, Bay Networks devices. There was a situation where the public community could actually query part of the enterprise MIB and obtain a list of communities on that device. And it was actually nice enough to give you information about the type of community it was, be it read-only or read-write. It presented an interesting situation where any user could obtain a list of valid communities and use information they glean from that to actually alter information on that device. Big problem. ARMON and ARMON2 really fall under SNMP. They're basically SNMP plus some other problems. They add the concept of action invocation, and they collect even further information than SNMP does. Again, think of that as SNMP with the same problems, and it's very similar. So what can you do to fix SNMP? Well, the best thing I can ever tell people to do is disable it. If you're using it, do whatever you can to ACL it. Use the longest community that your implementation supports. Again, longer passwords are better. If it's harder to guess, great. Don't use easily guessed things. Don't name your communities after your network name, for instance, or use something simple like router or SNMP. It's only going to cause a problem. And if at all possible, don't allow for remote setting of variables via SNMP. There's really no need to do it if you can avoid it. The next thing we're going to cover is like I said, some of the popular problems that have come out against routers and switches in the last year to 18 months to 2 years. These affected a lot of different types of devices and a lot of different vendors, and are sort of a generic listing with some specific examples of the kinds of problems that the devices you don't think too much about on your network may have for problems. So the first class I elected to identify were privilege mistakes. And basically these are kinds of things where a user on a device, which is considered unprivileged, in fact can execute things that their designers didn't intend them to do. And a recent example, and you can actually reference via that URL if you're interested in reading more about it and reading the actual post. There was a situation where unprivileged iOS users who hadn't entered an enabled password were actually able to show certain values that should only be accessible to enabled users. Things like a listing of ACLs on the machine, configured IPs, configured routes, and things like that. They weren't listed via the help service, but when users tried to execute them, they did in fact work. It's a problem in that often the implementation of these help services is given as a second thought, and there may be opportunity to do things that aren't obvious and aren't documented, but in fact you can do. The idea here being, just because you don't think you can do something doesn't mean you shouldn't try it. It might work. You might be surprised. Configuration format changes. Between revisions of a lot of these devices, they'll actually change the format of certain configuration files. or the information available, or how it's configured. One of the recent problems was Cisco had eliminated a keyword in an older version of iOS, and in more recent revisions, while it would error out on those things, it wouldn't actually configure the rule and just ignore the keyword. So what would actually happen is if you were using the TACACS-DS keyword in a rule, that whole line in the access list will actually be dropped and could potentially lead to access you hadn't thought about or hadn't known was a problem. And again, the point being here, make sure you're configuring your devices properly. If you see errors and you don't know what they mean, you probably want to check them out anyhow, because even things that seem innocuous and seem, I don't need TACACS-DS, you don't know what was entirely dropped. Make sure you know what's going on your devices. Features being used for security when in fact they shouldn't, or maybe they shouldn't. A lot of people use switches as security devices, and a lot of people have gone further and used what they call VLANs, or virtual LANs, as a security device. And what they'll do is they'll set up multiple VLANs on a single switch, and they'll use packet filtering or some kind of filtering mechanism to sort of keep an eye on traffic flowing between the two. And in certain situations, there were actually problems where if multiple switches were used and connected by a trunking port, it was possible for users on one VLAN of a switch to send packets to the other VLAN on the switch without having that packet filtered. It presented a problem in that it was a situation where you could bypass a feature that people were using for security. It wasn't necessarily intended for security, though, and it could be easily bypassed. It's not actually a Cisco problem. Cisco has indicated they think it's a problem with the 802.1q specification. So for those of you who are using VLANs as a security device, you might want to consider that as a problem. I mentioned switches. A lot of people use switches as a way of preventing sniffing, and it works fairly well in most situations. Once a switch has learned the MAC address of a host behind its port, in theory it shouldn't broadcast traffic all over the place and shouldn't make a mess of things. Often there's ways to defeat these switches and make them go back into a learning mode. Pick up, say, a broadcast address as a MAC address of a host behind its network, or behind its port, which leads to numerous problems. And again, if you can alter routing on a machine behind a port of a switch, I might not even need to bother with a switch. I'm able to get all traffic to come to me directly, and then I handle routing it back out to the outside world. Another big thing that we've been seeing a lot of in the last 2 years, people disclosing, are intentional backdoors in a lot of products. A lot of times these are just default accounts that are often documented within the books and the configuration information, though often they're undocumented accounts. And one recent example reference there is a 3COM switch that had a undocumented account that would allow full access to the machine, debug with a password of signet. Lots of devices have these. If not default passwords, then default undocumented SNMP community names, for instance. And these represent major problems. These are hard to prevent and really hard to understand because they're not documented, and vendors have done these things as a way of easing customer support and things like that. How do you defend against those? I guess keep up with revisions. Keep an eye on the full disclosure lists. I know that there's some people here who advocate those going away, but in fact, if they exist, you might not agree with them, but if you want to keep up with security, you do have to pay attention. And finally, printer flaws. It's actually a large problem, believe it or not. And some of the things it can be used for, just as an example, is laundering files, bounce attacks and denial of service attacks. A lot of printers have FTP servers. It's one method for getting on the device and actually printing information. A lot of them have hard disks, so they have a lot of storage. And there have been a number of instances where hackers or other, even employees or anyone who's attempting to hide information will actually use the FTP server on a printer as a way of laundering these things. So they'll drop it off on a printer, come in from another host, pull it off the printer without any kind of logging taking place. Most are poorly implemented, the FTP servers on these devices, and are susceptible to fairly old attacks like FTP bounce, where I could use an FTP server and the port command to actually make my connections appear to come from one place when they're actually coming from a different place, as well as some of the Berkeley LPD flaws in terms of gaining privilege. Denial of service. Everyone's familiar with smurfing and all those kinds of things. A lot of these printers love to respond to broadcast pings and things of that sort. Sometimes they have echo and charge-in and those wonderful things implemented as well. And it's hard to disable these sometimes. So finally, we can also always deny service to a printer. I don't think it's a major problem, but it certainly would annoy users. Most of these stacks are implemented really poorly, so they crash really easily, and their SNMP implementations almost always are substandard. Fixes, just like everything else, the best fix you can do is to disable things you don't use. If you don't use it and don't need it, don't run it. It's going to solve most of your problems. Finally, why am I telling you this? Again, it may seem innocuous, but anything on your network can be a problem if used by the wrong people. Finally, we've got some example applications. I think we've touched on a lot of these already. We'll go through them real quick. Actually, that should say defeat switching. If I'm behind a switch and I don't have access to other traffic on the network, if I can race ARP replies, I may be able to get all the traffic destined to one host directed to me. I may be able to get all traffic to be broadcast, big problem. Maybe able to overpopulate ARP caches, causing a flush and being able to impersonate then, or I may be able to alter routing tables and have all traffic come by me before going outbound. I can defeat things like SSH. It's good to use encryption, and it's good to use things like SSH, but if I can alter your routing tables, I may be able to easily do a man-in-the-middle attack. And while SSH will often say there's a key mismatch when it knows a host key, most people are guilty of ignoring that. They assume that the keys just changed and go on their merry way. If I can gain access to a router, obviously I can change routing flow and I can watch traffic as it flows by. So what do you do? Maintain good perimeter defenses. Like I said, we didn't touch upon flaws with that, and there definitely are flaws with a lot of ways people are doing firewalling and network design. But if you do it right and do it well, at least then you only have to trust people internal to your network, and hopefully you can do that. Use cryptographically secure transports. Crypto is good. I think you're going to hear that a lot in the next couple days. If you have the opportunity to use a secure cryptographic mechanism for your authentication or encryption, use it. Might as well. It might add overhead. It might somewhat diminish performance. But if security is your number one concern, then you should do that. However, without good policy, that does fail. The SSH example we previously went by is a good example. If people ignore warnings about failures in these strong authentication and security mechanisms, they're really worthless. And finally, disable unneeded services. If you're not using something, get rid of it. Again, disable route D. Use static routes if possible, and use strong authentication mechanisms. All right, that wraps things up. I guess we're opening things up to questions. Sorry, I can't hear you. Okay. I honestly know nothing about ISFRs. There are some people here who are very savvy with Windows 2000 security, who will be speaking, who are far, far more qualified than I am to talk about that stuff. In particular, I believe there's a guy named Joey who's going to be speaking tomorrow afternoon on Windows 2000 security, advanced security. He's probably the person to ask about that, and if not, there's a guy, Rooster, who's speaking, who also might be able to give you some insight on that. I don't want to give any information that might be wrong. Okay, if people have questions they want to come up here and ask instead, that's fine. I'll be sticking around here for a few minutes. Otherwise, thanks for bearing with me.